Recording. Right, so my name's Glen. I'm one of the co-founders of The Ethical Butcher, and I'm here today with Christopher Cooke, who is one of the owners and founders of 3LM. And to explain what that is, it's better that you do it than I do it.
Oh, it's interesting. It's rare I use the term own 3LM. I don't think we own 3LM. I think 3LM owns us. So we're on a mission, and our mission is to really broaden the adoption of regenerative management, and that's largely focused on land and livestock management. So yes, I'm one of the founders. Work with Sheila, my wife, Marianne Hill, a farmer who we work with. She's one of the founders as well, and today Sheila and I lead the main education and training arm, which is known as 3LM.
Great. And the reason that I wanted to talk to you is the conversation we're having now is what we tried to do on Earth Day, and we had some technology issues. And it was on Earth Day, I was thinking, it got me thinking the fact that 50 years later, 50 years from the first Earth Day, we're still having to have it, which means we're not really, oh dear.
It's okay. It's all part of the realism. Remember, it's Earth Week, so there's other people excited out there.
Close the outside door here.
So it could even be another time for the celebration of gratitude for the NHS, so who knows?
There is a gentleman that lives in our neighbourhood who thinks that the police put a possessed demon in his head in Islington police station in 1984 when he was arrested on a drugs charge, and every now and again it rears its head.
Well, it's probably an important reminder, Glenn, of the importance of the work that we do, because what we're really on this call to talk about fundamentally is health, human health, and how health cascades from the soil to the stomach to the soul. Yeah. And so in society today, there are many people who struggle because of largely malnutrition. I suppose the other big issue is trauma, but malnutrition largely is one of the greatest plagues of our lifestyle of today.
Yeah, and it's incredible how malnutrition can happen in a calorie overload as well. Malnutrition doesn't necessarily mean you're not getting enough calories. Just you can be getting more than enough calories and not enough nutrition. But that's a whole nother, before we dive in onto that kind of topic. But as we were sort of planning to do this conversation on Earth Day, it got me thinking, what do we need to do? What is Earth Day all about? And it's about an awareness that helps us to make better decisions. If I wanted to boil it down, that's what the messaging should be. That's what people should be thinking about, is how can we make small changes continuously that are going to have a large effect en masse. And I know that decision making is very much a part of your process with 3LM, which is kind of why I wanted to kind of bring you in on all this.
Okay.
But before we start, you mentioned regenerative agriculture, which is a term that I think people are starting to become more and more familiar with. And also just from the very beginning, I think it would be quite beneficial just to sort of dive right in and say, how does regenerative agriculture work, particularly when related to grazing animals? And how is it possible that you can produce a food that has a net loss of carbon? How does that happen?
Okay, right. I want to step back a bit though, just to remind you, it is Earth Week. So it's Earth Day extends over the full week. And the way to answer your question is really to look at how John McConnell, the founder of the Earth Day movement, really was holding on to a singular focus, which is a question of how do we really live in harmony with ourselves and with nature. And so we have that overarching context. So what we're doing today is we're learning to discover ways of managing a new harmony with nature. And there are many phraseologies out in the marketplace at the moment of which regenerative agriculture is one. And I want to make an important distinction. So the regenerative agriculture that I'm talking about is is a regenerative agriculture that's informed by a more holistic awareness. And that means that basically it's an appreciation that nature functions in wholes, and unless we appreciate that complexity and actually the mystery that goes with that, we've got a long way to go. So regenerative agriculture, as we encourage and support it, is able to choose any tool or a practice of agriculture, but use it in a way that's appropriate to a given context. And so that links me back to your question, which is the decision-making framework.
Mm-hmm.
Holistic management is predominantly a decision-making framework, which is quite unique because it specifically encourages us to test all of our actions and all our decisions against how aligned we are with each other, socially, economically, and most importantly, how aligned and what's the impact is that decision on the processes of nature. It is the only management decision-making framework that does that. Now that means that when we talk about holistic awareness, and I've just done another presentation which is coming into my head, but we've got to be able to differentiate between holistic thinking and all others. And what emerges in this holistic mindset, this holistic awareness, is the capacity to work with nature's processes, and that's radically different. And the decision-making, the process then not only serves to help us thrive in the way the world is today and anticipate the needs of tomorrow, because if you're holding that holistic context of harmony with each other and nature, that's the space in which we practice.
Yeah, but
it also
can I just jump in and ask something quite fundamental at this stage, is that all of our kind of science to date has been quite reductionistic rather than holistic. And we find it quite easy to say this action will have this reaction, but how can you possibly know what an action will do in a much bigger space? How is it, it seems like infinitely difficult to calculate what actions are in a holistic sense. How's that?
So it's a shift in awareness from the atomic or the particular interpretation of a conventional science to really understanding how we impact on the processes and flows of nature, within which there are many dynamics that we're literally scratching the surface to comprehend it. So COVID-19 is a great example. I really wish we weren't at war with this virus, because basically the sooner we choose to align with it and go with it and allow it to go to its full expression, the sooner it will leave us alone. So there's an understanding of the importance of understanding these life cycles, and the holistic awareness accepts that we cannot come up with a definitive answer. So there's an important premise here that we use the decision-making framework to align our decisions as best we understand with nature. But as you apply that and apply that in the field, you assume you're wrong, or you assume there's much more to learn. So you go into the practice with openness, and you train to observe the first signs, the first weak signals of deviation from what you expect, and then proactively manage it. This is why conventional science has difficulty reviewing or assessing holistic plant grazing, because it is such a proactive, not a reactive, and looking in your rearview mirror perspective to how we engage life on the planet.
Amazing, fascinating. So it requires a fundamental shift of mindset before you can even dive into it.
Well, I tend to think of it this way. Okay, these capacities are there in our species, in you and me, and we just need to learn to utilize them. We're not educated to utilize them. We're not encouraged to utilize them. If we use strange words, we can be classed as heretical. And that's really been the experience of Alan Savory over the last 50, 60 years, in that use the word holistic, people think of hippies, flowers and so on and so forth, when actually if we bring in the hard science, and that's basically the hard science that's more holistically oriented, if you look at science of integral theory, integral psychology, it clearly helps explain the distinctions between these worldviews and how we can then fully utilize and work with them, and most importantly release them within ourselves. And arguably you're in the business, you probably aren't fully aware of what business you're really in, but actually your contribution through healthy nutrition is part of the release process of these latent capacities, because the healthy nutrition gives the flexibility and adaptability that enables us to rise to these occasions and adopt new thinking.
Well, I slightly do kind of, there is a bit of thinking that's gone into this business in
Good.
that the purpose of the business, I mean, the purpose of the business isn't what the business does, but the purpose of the business is the higher point of that. And
Yeah.
we consider the purpose of our business to be connecting people back to nature. And by that, I mean, seeing how they relate to the cycles of life and death, where we sit in the food chain, what natural production is, and how to basically live and thrive on a proper diet, you know.
Yeah. Well, going back to your question about the decision making, so let's just build on that, because individuals make lifestyle choices. That's very, very suitable for the use of the holistic management framework, the decision-making framework. It helps us avoid getting into norms and habits that are harmful. Okay, so we're looking for beneficial practice. So the decision-making framework is applicable anywhere on the planet in any type of organization, and it's going to need that more holistic, systemic approach, because it's not just about what the farmers do, it's about how we develop policy, how we process food, how we distribute. There's a full examination, re-examination needed, and this is why I'm so passionate about what we do, because at the end of the day, the success and viability of this planet and our species is going to be down to the quality of the choices and decisions we take in alignment with how life works.
Yeah, no, I agree. But on a sort of practical level, is it, you know, there's a lot of people who probably just, we're really being barraged at the moment with a message that is grazing animals are destroying the planet.
Yeah.
And it's a really, really difficult message to go up against, because I feel that there's an awful lot of business behind that message. There's a lot of people that seek to benefit from that message. But just to people, you know, just to sort of explain to people how, you know, how can we actually use animals in a beneficial way? What is the process? What are we doing here? So you've explained the sort of decision making, but what's the sort of tire meets tarmac part of this?
Okay, so again, it's going back to, we need to make some distinctions. So when we talk about the production of meat, are we talking about handling livestock in an intensive feedlot situation? Now, because of what I do and the work I've done, you know, I've visited these places. They are literally as close to hell on earth as you can find. Okay, and I won't say any more than that. So those environments and those practices are degenerative. They are net degenerative. They exploit the resources, and it results in biases in nature that leads to unintended consequences. Climatically, it also affects the health of the animals, the handlers, and also the meat from those services. You know, we have to be careful what we eat. Now, the other spectrum that you're encouraging me to talk about, and it is all highly practical, this, is that if we understand how nature functions and we can mimic the really beneficial interaction between animals, the grassland, the plants they eat, and the soil, we get a boost of the wealth generating capabilities of our planet. So animals raised on grassland, where the migration and movement of the animals mimics what they would do in the wild. So they're not stuck in the field and being forced to eat grass that they pooed and weed on over the last weeks and months, but keep them moving, keep the grass fresh, making sure we're understanding we're managing the full expression of the solar panels. That's basically the gift to us all on this planet, is photosynthesis. We're maximizing the full expression of nature, and that's when the plants fully express the mineral cycle, the water cycle, the utilization of solar energy in full flight, and that's when the full nutritional benefit pass through the animals, and the animals synthesize those original elements into a form that we can most readily consume. Now, obviously, that diversity and distinctions extends through to the individual who eats this, the food that's produced. So there are many variables that we need to consider, but generally, you have animals raised in a way that's aligned and mimics nature fully, and this is true of any crop we grow, or any animal product, or any fiber that we grow. You mimic nature. That product, that food or fiber product, will be aligned with nature and be beneficial to those who consume and use it.
So again, that's totally in line with what you said about decision-making process. It's seeing something as part of a whole, not reducing it. So the feedlot that you describe is the analogy of the reductionistic approach of farming. And what
Yeah.
you're talking about is the holistic. So you're taking these animals and saying, how do they exist in nature? What are they part of? And are you actively rebuilding that environment, or are you allowing it to rebuild
Yes.
itself? What's the sort of process of transition?
Okay, well, the process transition, as I describe it, in terms of my work and understanding of change, the first thing we've got to do is recognize there's a problem. Okay,
Yeah,
and that's the recognition and looking back in from a more holistic stance. Then there's a response. It's being able to discern and design an appropriate way forward. Excuse me. And it may require a bit more learning. You may well have a sense that, oh, there's something needs to happen, but I don't know how. And that's where the education component comes in. Then the next stage is the early stages of what you do. If you're dealing with land that's very degraded, such as we're hearing conversations about on the planet at the moment, there's a recovery phase to be done. There's a reminding nature of how it functions. Sometimes if we stress nature too far, it falls over. You know, if you bring an animal fed in the shed out onto grass and that's the only life it's had, it has to relearn how to graze. Okay, so the recovery phase is equipping nature to revitalize itself and discover how to handle all these things, but it can do that very quickly. And then you're into the regenerative capability. Now, regenerative as a process, as where life is, these processes are fully engaged and being stimulated, both with their habitat, their engagement with the animals, and so on and so forth. That's not the end of the story. There's another stage, which is one that we have to be very cautious of, because it's a renewal stage. New life can express itself in responses to changing life conditions. Now, the way in which we see that occur most quickly is in bacteria and viruses. You know, we attempt to eradicate them through biocides, etc., pesticides, whatever, but those sides create a response, and those microorganisms have got a very much shorter lifespan cycle than ourselves, and they can adapt and respond in a whole new way. So what we're saying is this renewal capacity at a meta level where nature functions in harmony, that leads to new expressions of life that I believe we're going to see over the long run of time. But at the moment, if we just work with these short-term timescales, anything new that emerges is classed as not normal, and we try and squash it back to how we think it should be. So being normal is more than a setting on it. Is one of my clients once said to me in a psychiatric ward, he said, normal, that's just a setting on a washing machine. So it's a very open, creative process. And certainly with the farmers that we work with, I'm hearing language with the farmers now that I've heard over many years with people in more commercial settings, and the sense of release and relief when they go, thank God I'm not going crazy, because at last they can put into language what they experience and that latent capacity that they have as they appreciate the dynamics of the soil and the grassland and the animals, but they're not allowed really today to articulate that. So,
but in a sort of, in terms of, you mentioned, you know, there's a process where you take land that's very depleted and it's, you know, slowly changed into a different ecosystem. Presumably, there's a sort of response curve. You said it can be slow to start and then things speed up. Is there a flattening off? I mean, presumably there gets to a point where you've got as much carbon, you know, the system will reach an equilibrium, right? You cannot continue to regenerate forever, or to have this kind of, to create the sink forever. So what's the sort of long-term solution here? In an ideal world, we would get to a stage where we've reached equilibrium. What happens then? Or how does that experience happen in relating to agriculture?
Okay. So in relation to agriculture, there are practices in agriculture today that are practiced in these more temperate climates, which is called set-stop grazing. So the animals are left on a certain area of land month in, month out, and that's their world. So that tends to lead to very severe grazing and very selective overgrazing. So the farmer suddenly finds them overrun by what they call weeds. We call them forbs. And some of the land starts to change, and it doesn't produce them the grass that they're looking for. what we know is that if you manage that timing and so on, the relationship between the animals and the grassland, that land will recover, and you get a recovery curve, and you're right, it does start to stabilize. But basically, you can overcome and increase the productivity of the land by avoiding overgrazing, and you start to see the land naturally recovering. But that overgrazing is just one part of the conversation, because it's how you fully utilize the grass. And then there's another leap you can stimulate on top of the early one. So you can bring in and reduce what's called the over-resting. These are tools that are not common except in holistic management. We reduce the partial rest, and suddenly you find that the productivity of the land further increases. And then the third level is where you realize then that you're growing so much more grass, you can actually feed more animals, and that's the area that we're starting to appreciate. Now, you're right, there's a point of stabilization, but remember that every day things are restabilizing. Every day is climatically different, the land is different, and in this more temperate climates here in England and the UK, we have, you know, the seasonal variations. So all of that has to be considered. And when the grass is growing, when the temperature's above 5.5 degrees Celsius, for example, that's when we have an open-ended curiosity in our practice to discover what's possible. When the temperatures fall away, gets below 5.5 degrees Celsius, it gets cold, then we have to rely on stored reserves. But it's that when nature's in full flight, we really don't know what's possible. We live in a very industrialized landscape. We've had, you know, the last 800 years has really been man's domination of nature, and now we have a chance to turn it around and live with nature and enjoy. We're moving from a world of scarcity to a world of abundance, and I do believe that, you know, our part is small in the grander scheme of things, but the more we practice and the more our farmers and, you know, individuals across the full supply ecology learn, we're actually moving towards a bioeconomy, a radically different way of sustaining wealth on our planet.
But how, so this process you talk about, and we were both talking about this curve, I think it's worth explaining what's on that curve. And that curve is essentially an increase in life, right? An increase in biodiversity.
So increase in biodiversity, yeah.
So that when we're talking about this upward curve, we're talking about the sheer volume of living creatures, fungus, bacteria, everything in all these different trophic levels, all the way up, and how different that is to conventional farming, where you're only interested in one thing living, because that's the reductionist approach. So I think, you know, it got a bit esoteric there, but what that curve actually means is a more robust ecosystem. And I think there's a term within the Savory network of brittleness. Is that correct? Which is how resilient to change the system is. And am I right in saying that this curve, as it goes up and the system that we're using to grow food in becomes more complex, it becomes a lot more resistant to climatic fluctuations and change?
Yeah. So in conventional language, the greater the biodiversity, what we say, that leads to greater resilience. And how you encourage that increasing biodiversity is again part of the mystery, because we've eradicated so many species are disappearing off the planet as a consequence of our conventional practices. Again, we really don't know what's possible. But yeah, the principle is the greater diversity, the greater the resilience, which means that, and I know it sounds esoteric at times, but it's a radical shift in thinking, in that we're not into really counting the number of species. What we're looking at is increasing the vitality of that particular habitat. And if we're working with an understanding of how that habitat functions from the perspective of the whole Earth's ecosystem, we can plug and play this practice anywhere on the planet. That's really the function of the brittleness, to help us understand that when we're stimulating and working with these processes, yes, we've got a range of tools, but some tools that we could apply here. So the tool of rest, for example, if we applied that and we did nothing to land and it would very vibrantly recover here in the UK, if we apply that in more arid lands, that leads to accelerated desertification. So the brittleness is really the degree to which humidity is available at the soil-air interface throughout the whole season, and it brings in other factors.
Okay. Is that the metric then for brittleness?
That's the metric. It also brings in
Really
you've got to consider seasonality as well. But it means that you're able to go to anywhere on the planet, Glenn, and you do an assessment of brittleness, and then you know how to work beneficially in that particular context.
That's super interesting what you're talking about, that the kind of moisture level at the soil, because one of the farms I visited last summer when I was filming, making films for the Ethical Butcher, was Jane Oglesby farm. And she'd been working really hard with, just to let the land recover. She'd taken over some quite depleted monograss, I think she called it, dairyland. And this was a stonking hot summer day. I mean, it was absolutely as roasting as it gets in this country. And we were in stuff about this deep.
Yes.
And she said, put your hand in. And I was going down through all these grasses and thistles and stuff quite a long way before I could even get to the soil. And when I got to the soil, it was cool, damp, and crumbly. It was like cool cottage cheese. Yeah. And this was like, how is that possible? There was no sunlight hitting soil at all. And she was explaining how that is maintains an equilibrium year round, kind of.
Yeah. So it's one of the benefits of this work is it encourages everyone, the farmer, the practitioner, the person who produces and distributes the meat, such as you do, to get in contact with the land. And you've only got to do that once and you get it, okay? And then the principle can be generalized, because basically the means by which we keep the soil covered is one of the primary determinants of success. And I'm talking about keeping the grass covered by healthy green growing plants. So earth and the ecosystem processes are remarkable in handling the meta processes on the planet. And if we can work with that, many of the climate change issues we can recover from very quickly. So climate cooling is a function of what you described. That's the most efficient way in which we can actually address the heating.
Just stopping the ground being heated up by direct sun rays, just by having growth on the ground. Yeah, I mean, another farm I visited in the filmmaking process was a guy called Neil Harley, who's he was taking over arable and converting it into pasture. And it's a story that I tell quite often, because for me, it was one of the most crucial light bulb moments of what we're doing with the business. He was slowly converting land that had been on rotation with wheat, oilseed rape, and potatoes. Mm-hmm. And it was late summer, it had been planted with wheat. And you look at this field, and from the outset, it's actually quite beautiful. It's totally uniform. All the wheat's exactly the same height. And it's 100 acres of just pure, smooth, golden, wheat. But then when you look at it carefully, everything's in perfect rows, and you can see the soil, you can see the earth, and it was completely and utterly silent. Yeah. And he said, this is basically a desert in the UK. Yeah. And it kind of struck me as like a lightning bolt. Oh my God, we are making our own deserts by the way we're growing. And by contrast, he took me into a field which he'd turned back into pasture. And it had been, I think the cows had done rotational grazing for 2 years on this field. And I was up to here in various different plants and I asked him to name as many of them as he could. And he did a really good job, and really, really complex pasture. And I sat down to record some audio, because I wanted like background track of the countryside. And it was vibrant and alive. And it was like a Dr. Dolittle moment. I was visited by many creatures just sitting. And that made me realize this is a part of a system, and that is a dead system. I had a real kind of light bulb moment, because, I live in the middle of London, and I'm starting a business that's based on intellectual ideas. And that was like, shot with a diamond bullet kind of moment of like, oh my God, this is what we're actually doing. Yeah.
Perhaps you just described one of the essential qualities of an ethical butcher, to have an aspect of their awareness as a Dr. Dolittle-like embracing of the life. But seriously, when we get into nutrition and individuals, many in society today realize that nutrition is of primary importance to health, and certainly COVID-19 is really reinforcing that. But to understand how nutrition flows through the microbes in the soil that prepare the nutrients for the plants, that then convert it into a form the animals can most readily process themselves, that then leads to minerally dense meat and so on and so forth. that's when we really need to understand how these flows of these processes result in health. And I know that in that call we attempted to do the other day before the technology failed me, there were many questions of curiosity about particular enzymes and particular proteins, for example. And what I would say is that what we know is if you derive grass, meat and product, and I'm talking about food and fibre, from land that is vital and vibrant, the spectrum of what's available in that food stuff is way beyond our capacity to monitor it at the moment. And we work closely with veterinary surgeons around the world, and many of them extending to the human domain. Basically, we're looking for the 90 essential nutrients, and that's just basically saying that's what we know of, and there's a whole world beyond that.
The iceberg stuff, yeah, and the human body is very resilient at, which is why we've been a successful species, is that we can derive in extreme cases from nutrition from things that other creatures cannot. There's a lot of things we eat that other animals won't, that we can make do with, which is how we've able to spread through all these different climatic zones.
Yeah. So going back to your question about regenerative agriculture, it's become a generalized term, but unless a particular method or particular practice excuse me, understands their impact on these processes of nature, it cannot really truly call itself a regenerative practice. And I know that sometimes Alan Savory comes across as quite critical, but he's right. He's really saying, unless you can prove that you are leaving behind a regenerative soil, that practice is actually quite degenerative. So much of what we're doing now is helping add in this knowledge of the decision making and the awareness of the ecosystem processes onto all forms of agriculture. So we
arable as well. We're not just talking about beef, pigs, chickens, sheep. It's arable. You can apply the techniques to
you name it, from vineyards to to hemp production, from crops to we extend internationally. So what came to mind then was we have the Peruvian Andes where their delicacy is a hamster, not something a guinea pig, sorry, not something we would eat here, but we have to have that flexibility and scope and understand how that native or indigenous diet fits part of their natural lifestyle. Living at 16,000 feet up in the Andes, it's exactly the same conversation from a holistic management point of view in terms of choices and decision making and discernment as it is downtown London when you're growing vegetables in your garden or choosing what to buy over the counter.
Now, you've really brilliantly segued me into that last phrase you said, when you're choosing what to buy. That's brilliantly segued into the last thing I wanted to talk to you about.
Okay.
Which is, how do we, on a practical level, we've talked about some sort of grand ideas and sort of new ways of thinking and everything, but Earth Week, a lot of people are bombarded with different messages. Go vegan, save the planet. Eat grass-fed meat, save the planet. How do people, on a practical level, on a day-to-day level, how do you make a shift in mindset to have a positive impact, not a negative one? What's the process there, and what can people do, and how do you test this out? It seems so big and so difficult on a sort of day-to-day practical level. Walking out to the shops tomorrow, doing an online shop tomorrow, what can people do to improve their impact?
That's a big question.
It is, but
and it's something I've been pondering this week, because I pressed the pause button on Earth Day myself and just reflect on how do we contribute to the ideals of the Earth Day, and I think the Earth Day is chunked into six principles. One is education, so really go and find out information from sources that are practicing from a more holistic stance. Okay. And so that education and awareness is a key part of it. Linking art to science is an interesting one. So what does that really mean? It means that, like I spoke about the farmer, there's sometimes things that we get a sense of that we can't articulate. And it might be around how particular foodstuffs interact with us, or how we interact with our gardening or whatever, or that when we touch a piece of fruit. Well, try to avoid pushing too hard on the mind and draw pictures and allow the new words and the new expressions to unfold. and I've gone blank on the other four, but in principle, it's through practice that stimulates our awareness. And if nothing else, you gave a really good clue to one of the practices. It's when you're talking about grassland and animals and so on. So just when you're walking down a street and there's a hedgerow next to you, just put your hand into the base of the grass and just notice what you notice about the way the temperature varies, the moisture varies. So it's stimulating our sensory awareness.
Mm-hmm.
But and that's then helps us make sense of the education and the other insights that we're learning. And it's primarily about how we take all that and act. And probably one of the biggest learnings for me around Earth Day, my reflections was, wow, the power of the customer on today's planet. So the day before, oil prices went negative. Now, the customer didn't choose to stop buying oil, but it stopped. So for if you are concerned about your health, the health of the planet, the continued viability of the human species, not only on this planet, but in the universe, which I think is a question we need to have at some stage. Every pound or every unit of currency that you choose to use for food purchase or purchase of fibres is actually probably one of the most significant processes we do at the moment. It's more, for me, it's more powerful than our democratic vote at the moment.
Yeah. You're voting with your pound a lot more than you are with your ballot paper, I think. Because that's what drives everything. And holistic thinking around finance is another conversation that we'll have one day. But I just wanted to kind of add to what you were saying there is about, for me, one of the crucial things that people can do to make better decisions, and I'm talking strictly about food here, really, is to try and develop an awareness of the effect that foods have on your body. So, and I don't mean, because there are foods that have an instant gratification, like junk foods are engineered. I studied this. Part of my food science degree was working out what to put in Twiglets and Pringles to make people overeat them. And, you can make food that has a high, quick gratification, but the gratification is very short-lived. And afterwards, you generally feel like crap because you've eaten something very unnatural and your body doesn't know how to deal with it. When I say develop an awareness of how foods make you feel, if you have cravings, there's a reason for that. It could be good or bad. When you eat something, it does something to you. There's a physiological change. And when you tune into that and kind of follow it, you will just start to make better decisions.
Absolutely.
And don't believe that something is healthy just because you've been told it is, if it makes you feel terrible when you eat it. There are so many kind of plant toxins that we're not used to dealing with that you think, I don't know, lentils are healthy, but if you get bloated every time you eat them, that's not good for you.
So there's many myths and norms that we need to overcome, and we've all been enculturated in our own ways. So we have to press the pause button every now and then and question every basic assumption around by which we're living. And certainly what you're saying is trust what your body tells you. But also be aware that sometimes we can get addicted and drawn in because our senses are one of the easiest. Our taste buds are some of the easiest senses to seduce into new, not too beneficial practices. So the taste and the quality, and that's another important thing. You asked about the mindset and stimulating the holistic mindset. Be aware that as this worldview starts to emerge, our sensory repertoire becomes more refined and much broader. And the first line of development seems to change is a more spiritual dimension. So people start hunting for a new way forward, and that then leads to a space in which they start to ask new questions. But they may well be overwhelmed periodically by the new sensory experiences that food starts to taste differently. So the capacity to discern changes over time. So it's just helping people be aware that that's normal and healthy and go with it, surf the open wave of this newness rather than going to get it fixed because you're abnormal. Okay, so be approximately right.
And throw away your belief systems.
Yeah, I mean, the premise of Alan Savory, which I love, is look, we've been totally wrong in most of the decisions we've made around how we run our societies. Now is the time to improve it and be approximately right, and that's all we can say. Find ways to be approximately right and watch your health improve.
Amazing. I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, thank you. That's been a treat. I'll stop the recording.
That's really good. Yeah.